Welcome everybody. My name is Jane Clossick and thank you so much for joining us today. This is the first in the series of workshops which are going to examine the phenomenon of urban depth from a range of disciplinary perspectives and at different scales, and with a particular focus on how it relates to individual autonomy. It'd be really great if as many as possible of you could keep your cameras on, because it's so nice to see people's faces, and it's particularly when you're doing the presentation, it's so nice to see people and not feel like you're talking into a void. And it's okay even if you're popping out or doing other things. I don't think you have to be like staring into your camera looking engaged all the time, but it's just great to see people's faces and where you are. But of course, please keep your microphones off, which I see you all have, until later when we have our discussion. And just as a heads up to everybody, we are recording this session and the recordings will be on our website when we finished. This first workshop is called Architectural Depth, and it's focusing on the architectural or building scale. And we've got 6 10-minute presentations from people who are working on this topic in a range of different fields, followed by an open discussion between those 6 presenters and you, the audience. The people we've got speaking today are Machiel van Dorst, David Littlefield, Natalia Olszewska, Karolina Kanetska, Paula Corthon, and Bobby Supatira. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for agreeing to come along and participate in this slightly experimental project that we're doing. The team behind the workshops is me. I'm Senior Lecturer in Urban Design at London Metropolitan University, and I trained as an architect, but I did a PhD, which was a study of urban depth in Tottenham High Road. And I've been working with my colleague Ben Coburn, who's the Professor of Political Philosophy at Glasgow University, on this project for probably about a year, maybe more, maybe 2 years. Ben, would you like to say a short introduction to yourself?
Not much more to say than what you've said already, Jane. Yes, so I'm a political philosopher and ethicist by training, and I work up in Glasgow. But Jane and I have been talking informally about these ideas around depth and how we might analyze it philosophically for several years. Actually, we've been talking about it loosely, and we've been working more formally together for about a year.
Thank you, Ben. And we've also got our fantastic research assistant, Hannah Parr, who's organised and planned these workshops. And Hannah is training as an architect at London Met, and she's just finished her part 2. Sorry if you all heard that, that was my doorbell ringing very loudly. Now, it would be really great if we could find out who all of you are as well. So Hannah is going to paste the link to our Miro board, and that's the online whiteboard that we're using for this workshop session and future workshop sessions. So if you haven't already, do click on that link and have a fiddle with the Miro board, including putting your name on a post-it note on the left-hand column, which is purple. And the Miro board is yours to add to really in any way that you please. So add your thoughts, add questions or suggestions there. Anything that comes up for you, just write it on a sticky note and put it on the Miro board. And please don't worry about messing it up or doing something inappropriate, because we want it to be a mess. We want it to be a record of the messiness really of the topic that we're engaging with. And it'll be a really useful source for us afterwards when we're analysing what's happened during the workshop. So please put any questions or any information you can think of, and if you have any trouble with the Miro board, either send a private message to Hannah, or if you prefer, you can just put your question or comment into the chat here in Zoom, and we'll put it onto the Miro board for you. So you'll also find on the Miro board the links which have got information about future workshops. And we've also prepared a briefing document that's linked from the Miro board, and maybe Hannah could put the link to that in the chat here as well. And that's a document that we've prepared for today, which you may have already seen. It's been emailed out, but maybe you haven't had a chance. And it's got a lot more information about what we're doing and why. And also on the board is our Twitter handle and hashtags. And it would be really great if you're a Twitterer, if you could tweet about what we're doing. So very briefly, I'll give you a little overview of my perspective on the function of these workshops. And the purpose is to understand the significance of urban depth to different disciplines, maybe to establish a common language between us, as well as to start to build up a collaborative network around this topic, with a view to making a funding bid for a larger project to investigate urban depth in a range of different contexts for comparison and analysis. And also we really just want to see what happens. We're very open to the outcomes from these workshops. We're not particularly expecting anything specific. It's more that these are a form of research through discourse. What happens when people come together and discuss this topic? So what we're doing here is quite innovative and a bit experimental. We've got no preconceived ideas, and you are all very welcome to shape what the outcomes are. That would be fantastic if you would get involved in that way. So now we're going to begin our presentations. And when the speakers have finished, Ben is going to chair the discussion, which is great for me because it means hopefully I can engage in the discussion. It's almost impossible to chair and engage simultaneously. And each speaker has got 10 minutes. And speakers, I've said this to you already, but I'm going to be a bit draconian about those 10 minutes because we only have 2 hours in total. I'll warn you when you've had 8 minutes. And if you have any questions or comments for the speakers, please do put them onto the Miro board in the appropriate box. Or, as I said, into the chat here in Zoom, if Miro is terrifying to you. And first up, we've got David Littlefield. David is a senior lecturer in the Department of Architecture and the Built Environment at the University of the West of England in Bristol. David's research focuses on place, heritage, authenticity, and its representation, and he's published on architectural narratives and the role of regeneration in London and Liverpool. So David, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'll share my screen and I will share my document. So hopefully, and Jane can confirm, I hope you can all see my slide number 1?
Yes.
You can. Perfect. Okay. So I'll start now. So hello everybody. Nice to meet you all. I don't know many of you. I know Agostina. So hello Agostina, really nice to see you. I'm going to be talking about a range of different things really, and I've brought together what might be an eclectic range of ideas, partly intentionally, but also just the stuff I'm interested in terms of place and space and regeneration and how to think about the places around us. And I'd like to just sort of throw some ideas concerning definitions really, and trying to unpick some ambiguities. And probably I'm going to do what I think I'm best at, which is asking questions, rather than what I perhaps should be best at, which is providing answers. Trying to go on to the next slide. Oh, there we are. Slide on the left. I don't have to introduce that. You all know what that slide is and what it represents. So in terms of urban depth, I thought it would be worthwhile just spending a couple of minutes thinking about what we mean by public place and private place, and the ways that these places are depicted, represented, mapped, and to consider that there are publicly accessible places that are very much territories or zones to which we feel we belong, whoever we are, and other times these places get taken away from us. They are appropriated, dominated, they become scary for reasons merely to do with occupation rather than anything to do with legal boundaries or a legal sense of ownership. It's more of an intangible and nuanced type of ownership. In which case, in considering public place and private place, we like to think of ourselves as private citizens and yet members of the public. And there's a difference between public ownership of places in terms of a legal ownership and private ownership. And yet we often encounter private places that are publicly accessible, like a supermarket. And there's the reverse of that, publicly accessible or publicly owned space that is not necessarily accessible. So in terms of depth structure, I think it's also what, as part of the set of terms that we consider, it's who are we, how far are we trying to access? How deep do we want to go? And is there some kind of legal or expectation or behavioral, psychological set of structures that we navigate? So all of these things are quite nuanced and overlapped and complex. Some years ago, well, 10 years ago or more, I wrote a book about the redevelopment of central Liverpool, which in more recent years has turned into a set of commissioned studies commissioned by Grosvenor, who now own, effectively, the centre of Liverpool. And with a colleague of mine at UE Bristol, Mike Devereux, we first wrote for Grosvenor a literature review on the nature of public and private place, in fact, the nature of the privately owned but publicly accessible place, followed by an urban design study of Liverpool 1, the Grosvenor-owned retail-led mixed-use regeneration project in the centre of the city. And one of the things I'd like to talk to you about briefly is the boundary of that site. Image bottom right, you can see a graphic that shows quite clearly what Grosvenor owns in the centre of Liverpool. And that zone is surrounded by a legal boundary that's represented by those little metal studs set into the pavement around the site. Image on the left, you can see into the distance a branding boundary of those banners, and then the other image, more of a defensive boundary with the bollards. Now, it does get quite complex and quite deep. So Paradise Street in central Liverpool, which is one of those streets that moves from the publicly owned the Liverpool City Council zone into the private realm of Grosvenor territory, is actually a very deep boundary. So furthest away from us, there's the legal boundary where you'd find those metal studs. And then in the mid-ground, there's the branding boundary of the banners. And then closest to us is that defensible boundary, that defensive boundary of the bollards. It's the branding boundary. The legal boundary is often overlooked and unnoticed. The branding boundary is maybe noticed as part of a general flavour of the zone. It's the defensive boundary which most members of the public will notice, especially if you're trying to drive through it. However, there are some members of the community who really know the difference between these boundaries. And I think this is where this gets significant. To homeless people, that legal boundary is incredibly visible and very, very tangible. The image on the left, we can see a stud in the foreground towards the bottom of that image. So the image was taken from private property, in effect. Looking across to the bin, marked the city of Liverpool, so looking over into publicly owned territory. And the homeless guy in the tent, he's on the City of Liverpool side of the legal line, as is the guy with the megaphone, who's standing outside the studded legal boundary and broadcasting his message of selling the big issue into the private zone of Liverpool 1. It has to be said, actually, this guy could go and get a license from Grosvenor to sell the big issue. So this is an image of a guy who doesn't have a license and yet wants to draw attention to himself, to local shoppers and passers-by over that legal boundary, invisible to us, more or less, but very, very visible and tangible to some groups. Another thought I just want to sort of throw into the mix really is the nature of signs. Privately owned but publicly accessible space is often critiqued, criticised or condemned really for the number of rules that it has on site. However, publicly owned, publicly accessible spaces have rules too. So the images at the top of the screen are in public places, including the Eiffel Tower in Paris and a little square in Seville in Spain. So it's not a UK phenomenon. We find rules everywhere. The image I'm especially interested in, top left there, is you are in a designated public place. That's from Castle Park in the centre of Bristol. And I find that just an interesting phrase for a member of the public to be told that they are in a designated public place. The nature of signs is interesting, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But you do have to wonder the extent to which signs like these visible applied signs of text and graphic, are almost the small print of design. Does it indicate in some way a failure of design? Is design not working hard enough so that we have to have this sort of application of rules made very visible? Or is there something about society where we don't know the rules anymore? And this goes beyond what architecture, design, urban design can actually usefully do, that we need these things to step in and remind us of codes of behavior that maybe we're uncertain of. Now, this is a place that I imagine Agostina will recognize, Fountain Centre in Belfast, which is a very interesting place, and a place that it's an odd place. It's first story level, so you go up an escalator to access this external place. It's a retail-led space at an elevated level, but it is sort of designed with the idea of joy and play in mind. There are these bells that go off at regular intervals.
You've had 8 minutes there, David.
It's kind of charming. There's a fountain with little statues of kids playing in the water and so on. And yet the signs work against the design. The signs there are much more about caution, warning, restriction of the ways that people can occupy this place, which I find an interesting tension between sign and design. Something else I'm going to throw into the mix really is the sign of the roof, and I do sort of pose this as something that the group might want to think about into the future, the difference between a place which has a roof and that which doesn't. And I do wonder, thinking about shopping malls in particular, where the presence of the roof and therefore a space becoming an interior space somehow changes things more than you might imagine. And I just want just a couple of words on the undesigned as a sign of occupation and how far we can go and what we can do. And my work recently at Bath Abbey has been to examine the floor, which is undergoing a serious change right now. And what that change involves is the erosion and presence of people and occupation over many centuries is now being reversed. It's sort of being undone. And I think this is important to look at the texture of surface, because other than the graphic and text-based signs that I showed earlier, I think we read places through the textures and we can see where people have been before us. And a quick before and after of Bath Abbey. And this is my last slide really. To finish, I suggest there's a couple of big ideas maybe that we might all consider in terms of depth, structure, place and access. One is the relationships between people, places and things, whether places have, or whether things and objects and places have a kind of inherent quality, a kind of essence. Do things have thing power? And what is agency? How much do people invest in the objects, places and surfaces around us? Is it very much on the side of the psychological projection, where we imagine intangible qualities on inanimate matter, or does matter actually embody within it something very powerful, like say the metal stud around the circumference of Liverpool One in Liverpool? And just a couple of references just to show you that I'm not making this up, that I've actually written about this. There we go. Thank you very much. How's that? Hang on, I can't hear you.
I said thank you, David. What a great, fascinating presentation. I was all prepared then, and then I was muted and didn't say anything, couldn't be heard. Really great opening presentation for the session, actually. And next up we have Paula Corthon, and Paula is a Part 1 architecture student here at London Met, but she has also got a long-standing practice in the field of exhibition, interiors and product design. And she was nominated for the RIBA Bronze Medal Award in 2020 and the AJ Student Prize in 2020. And Paula seeks a deeper understanding of how architecture impacts on our everyday lives. So Paula, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, David. That was really interesting. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Not quite yet.
Quite yet. Bear with me. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, lovely. Okay. Okay, I've got a strict deadline, so I'm going to just whiz straight through mine. I have a lot of slides. Okay, so I'm going to delve straight in. Okay, architectural depth is rich by nature, and so it makes sense to seek examples of rich and diverse methods that promote autonomy. Sorry, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to go from one to the other, sorry. In the workshop today, I'm going to present 3 very different architectural projects. I will look not only at the exterior and interior spatial layouts, but crucially, I'll look at architectural links or cues that are employed to feed a richness and depth that encourages autonomy. My first study is a housing scheme by MAE Architects, completed in 2018 and commissioned by Camden Borough Council. Built on a former car park, it comprises of 13 new homes, a community hall, a public square, and community gardens. Through a number of design features, the scheme encourages choice and opportunity. It allows the freedom to engage with fellow residents as well as the wider community. The design enables a higher level of social interaction and reduces the risk of isolation. The low-rise building and extended sightline along Robert Street provides a generous view with a closer physical connection to the street. The entrance to the maisonettes sit alongside the entrance to the community hall and is denoted by a pair of raised planters. Proximity to the hall creates greater opportunities for more diverse social exchanges. The hall at ground level is fully visible along 3 elevations via large glazed windows and doors. Activities are in full view, enhancing a feeling of accessibility and participation. The full height windows and doors also offer views from Robert Street through to the community gardens behind. A new paved square emphasises a visual cohesion and a potential social meeting place. The maisonettes are accessed via lift and stair through a secure communal glazed door from Robert Street. The communal front door has views and direct access to the garden behind. The housing block contains a small number of units that create both independence but also opportunities for shared experiences. All units have double aspect living spaces with views to both communal gardens and the street. Generous terraces enable interaction to happen with the street and other residents. The elevated pavement allows for social exchange with neighbours and a sightline to other activities in the surrounding area. The full height glazed doors and windows from the living spaces to Robert Street and large windows from kitchens through to the gardens provide a visual openness by expanding sight lines that permit greater participation in the outside world. My next study building is a renovation and extension of the Historic Art Museum in Nantes, France. The project was completed by Stanton Williams in 2017, with the premise that the new museum would be fully accessible and offer equal access to art and literature for all, with tailored routes, bespoke events, and an array of community projects. The museum has been renovated and includes the addition of 2 new buildings and an excavated basement under the palais. Externally, the main entrance has been repaved, high railings removed and lifts installed. The alterations support greater accessibility and also provide a visual connection from museum to the street and in turn museum to the community. The entrances to the new buildings B and C are key design features. They offer alternative access points to the historic entrance which faces the main street. They crucially provide the opportunity to create a different look and feel as an important feature in broadening community appeal and engagement. The full height glazed doors at each new entrance allow clear views through to objects, artworks and activities that lie inside. They also allow sight of further routes through the building complex and open spaces in between. Full height windows are also used to display a variety of information, including current and future events. The main entrance has been renovated so that emphasis is placed on clarity, openness and continuity. New glazed automatic doors provide access to all. A member of staff greets all visitors. An uncluttered foyer creates minimal distraction and promotes clear understanding of the space in key zones. 2 reception desks provide information on all activities within the building. The library and cafe have double door access, are clearly visible and fully accessible. Subtle signs offer further directional information to other areas. A neutral palette of new stone for all floors and neutral paints for walls create a feeling of unity and free-flowing accessibility. Uninterrupted sightlines are created from entrance foyer to the cafe, bookshop and main gallery at its centre. The new basement houses the auditorium and a new educational centre. 3 access points derived from the main palais and the 2 new external buildings. Information about activities are retrieved prior to entry and repeated again within this level. The new floor has a dual purpose in that it provides a richer experience for the community by broadening its activities and also creates new opportunities that encourage diverse social interactions between users and visitors of the old museum and that of the new. In other words, the new spatial arrangement helps to bring together a more diverse user group, offering new sociospatial exchanges. To support this and provide a new and more accessible programme to all, the new architecture creates an uncomplicated, defined route throughout basement level. Wide corridors allowing an overview of the area. Material changes that denote new thresholds. Uniform flooring to create continuity and a feeling of accessibility to all. Generous seating areas for resting and social exchange, and a defined, accessible route to the original Palais building. My next case study is a small but interesting project completed in 2019 by Neri and Hugh. The new Art and Community Centre is located in Aranya, a port town in China. The building has an irregular shape. It is a space for art as well as a space for the community. It contains 5 galleries, a cafe and an open-air amphitheatre at the centre, which is also used as a communal space for the local residents. The structure differs from the surrounding vernacular and might appear either intimidating, intriguing or less inviting. However, the architects use a series of features that welcome the viewer to discover what lies within. Exterior seating of the same building material serves a visual connection between the building and the community.
You've had 8 minutes.
Thank you. They also serve as a resting point or a social gathering point. The main entrance doors are partially obscured, although highlighted by the indent at the building's corner. The viewer is invited to look closer through a window aperture without having to look inside first. The heart of the building is revealed from here, enabling decisions to be made as to whether to enter or not. A large full-length window next to the entrance provides information about activities within, and further windows at every elevation provide clear views of different internal zones. On entry, the central walkway ascends around the curved amphitheatre wall. Cues are offered that aid navigation and define zones. Sightlines towards the exterior through openings within the walkway walls provide cues to orientate the user. The flooring throughout is a continuous surface of unpolished concrete, adding to a feeling of fluidity from one level to another and from one area to another. All areas have a feeling of being uninterrupted and fully accessible. The architects also use light and form to further aid navigation and understanding. The visitor is guided towards each gallery space by the ascending walkway. During the day, threshold points are highlighted by a controlled use of natural light against the internal shadow. Internal window cutouts continue along the path, providing more information about other levels and positioning of balcony vantage points. These key locations support an understanding of the overall spatial order. Do I have time for the last one or not? I've got one slide here.
If it's 30 seconds, yes.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, the last slide shows the basement, which is it houses the theatre and cafe. They can be directly accessed by a lift and 2 sets of stairs from the ground floor. The first image of the viewing platform at ground level offers another opportunity to peer inside of the activities below before entry is made. The cafe has a defined boundary by the presence of a solid wooden door, but counteracts this with 3/4 glazing to one side, so that visibility is not impeded. From within the amphitheatre, a multitude of sightlines are afforded to the viewer. There are views to the cafe, views to the glazed gallery space, and also views upwards towards the other levels. And that completes my presentation. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Paula. What a lovely, articulate, enjoyable presentation you've just given. Thank you so much. And as Hannah's just posted in the chat, if you could unshare, Paula, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, sorry. Okay.
Yes, Hannah's just posted in the chat. For those who've joined since we began, we have a Miro board, and please do click onto it, add your name onto the left-hand side, and then add any thoughts or questions that come up for you or comments, so that we've got more fuel for our discussion when the presentations are over. So next up we have Bobby Supatira, and Bobby trained as an architect and worked in Thailand and London before beginning his PhD here at London Met with a brilliant supervisory team. And his work is on the spatial and social practices involved in the creation of cosmopolitan identity for Thai people living in London. So Bobby, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Shall I share the screen? Okay. Can you see the screen now? Yeah.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Right. Well, before I started, so I would like to just introduce a little bit about my PhD research, building on these issues of multiculturalisms and identities in contemporary cities. So my research interests in understanding the process of identity construction and a negotiation between Thai migrants and the multi-urban cultures of London. I would like to begin my presentation with this quote from Jonathan Raban's Soft Cities, in which he stated, "Living in the city is an art, and we need the vocabulary of art of styles to describe the peculiar relationship between man and materials that exists in the continual creative place of urban living." This is brought me to my intention of these 2 key questions, which is how might we recognize and understand identity construction and negotiation between Thai communities and London urban culture, and what is the interpretative or practical role of architecture in defining a place associated with Thai communities in London urban environment. and this is from the field work that I have. So basically, this is the a diagram which is show my a thematic analysis of the study of a category of home, introduce the space experience of Thai migrants participants in a home experience. And before that, so sorry, let's go back. So basically it's come up as from interview of 15 participants, I come up with three key themes, which is first, it's the role and responsibility. Second is propriety, and the last one is nostalgia. Before I start with my participants, that I would like to show you is this, the movie called Hardbound. It's a movie about three women from the poor family in northeast of Thailand who left the family in Thailand and searched for marriage with a foreign men in order to help support the shortfall of their household income. My main protagonist of my research, it's no different. Basically, she come to London, married to the foreign British men in order to help support her family, and to be able to be in London, that give her equal opportunity in terms of gaining having access more to a financial and support, and have a better life. And this is how I started to understand the role and responsibility, which is reflecting to the everyday living in her house, which first you can see the housework in the kitchens and in the dining room where she prepared food for her husband, help her to complete her life in the UK or in England. And also the desk area in and around in that living room there, give her a sense of reminding her why is she coming to London at the first place. That's to help her to work hard every day and support the family. In the propriety category part of the theme, which is I would like to compare it with the outline of a traditional Thai house, which you can see that number one there. It's kind of like the open, kind of semi-open space where Pan herself, the participants will describe her dining room as a kind of like a semi-public space where she gather there with friends and people who are coming in, and then she using that sort of number three, which is the kitchen. Also in Thai tradition, how we have like a kind of separate kind of building into it next to that, and then you have number two, which is the living room in the London sort of Victorian house, but then in her Thai kind of imaginative house is actually like a living kind of private space. I can't get it. Okay, next. So again, like you can see, this first, number one, cooking Thai food is the way of being social life for Thai people. So whether they're gathering in kitchens or, sitting around in the dining room, if it's got too much ground, then they can use the space around the floor. Also, why they enjoy Thai with Thai friends in the dining room and the kitchens, then her husband, on the other hand, will enjoy watching TV, watching football with her friends in the living room, rather. And also that's, so basically in the living room there, which is number four, she's intended to use that as like a kind of more private a family gathering, spending family time together with her husband. So the main sort of kind of more public space will be within number one rather than in the living room. And it's kind of like themes coming out of it. And the last one is nostalgia, which is first using this area and keep contact with her Thai family in Thailand. Also looking at watching Thai melodrama from YouTube and things like that. The calendar, which most of Thai people were familiar with, with the image of Tai King. This is something that's kind of like a role model to the people. So they were looking at the calendar and remind themselves that to keep doing the good things in every day. And also in the kitchens wise, cooking Thai food is just the way of maybe transport herself quickly to Thailand in terms of having a sense of cooking, smells and food and stuff like that. And also with this kind of image that she mapping between the life back in Thailand at the top and kind of the life, her life in London. You can see the time difference there is about six hours. So in the 6 o'clock in the morning, where she's going with working in the farm with friends, and or basically it's family basically, but there's a family and friends there, and also going at lunchtime. So her life is sort of all together at once, like there's no public or private kind of time, so it's all at once. And she spent time, so 6 o'clock, come back at home, having meal together, watching TV, family time, and then cooking in the kitchen. Same in London, she probably could actually map herself through kind of the same sort of activity between going to work at the restaurant, just like she going to work in the farm with the family. So now her friends and colleagues in the restaurant become kind of more close and family. Having been in regular to the shop nearby, giving her a sense of belonging into the place. And then also cooking in the kitchens, also giving her both pride of herself as being a good housewife, and also for her to actually keep not missing home by cooking Thai food. And to map all that together, that you can see this looking between the spatial aspect and the socio-cultural aspects of it, and mapping that all together, so we can see which part of her social kind of context and the spatial context to give her the foothold or a feeling of trying to complete her life in a different place where she came from. I think that's I'll finish from this. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Bobby, and plenty of time as well. Beautiful images as always, and I'm sure your presentation has prompted lots of questions and thoughts. Just another reminder to everybody, do keep adding things to the Miro board because it's starting to fill up, which is nice. And it's also easy to forget the questions that occur to you while you're watching somebody speak. So next up, we have Karolina Kanetska. And Karolina is a practicing architect and urban experience designer based in Switzerland. And she's interested in how people interact with their physical and digital environments. And she advocates for a human-centered and research-based approach to design. So Karolina, I'm very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Hi, thank you for inviting me for the workshop. In today's presentation, I would like to talk about choice architecture and nudging in the built environment. In regard to the topic of the workshop, I would like to focus on behavioral science insights and how they relate to architectural and urban design. And I will also mention a digital aspect of it. So what we've learned in the past 20 years from behavioral economics is that our choices are not as rational as it was previously thought, that we are influenced by cognitive biases, environment, our emotions, and social norms. On the right side, you can see two very influential books from Nobel Prize winners in economics, probably very well known to. One is Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman, and the second one is Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which is called Nudge. And I will use some concepts from the other book in the further part of my presentation. So Thaler and Sunstein coined the topic, the theme, nudge theory and choice architecture. What is nudging? Nudging is a way of influencing human behavior. Is the way that choices can be engineered so that individuals still free to choose are inclined or encouraged towards a certain choice that benefits them. So nudges are a sort of encouragement, they are not mandates. The nudging strategies seem to be very effective in public policy making, in social media, in marketing. But how does this relate to space? Are we actually nudged in the physical space? So the first example I'm showing here is Google Maps, which many of us uses for navigation. It turns out that Google accepts payments from merchants in exchange of routing potential customers next to their location. So if we think sometimes we are taking the fastest route, it might be actually compromised by commercial considerations. Oh, sorry. The second example is the Pokemon Go, which is quite popular in recent years, AR application, where digital objects, Pokemons, are placed in the cityscape. It is now well known that restaurants and coffee shops accept, actually the game owners pay the other way around. The restaurants pay to game owners for locating Pokemons next to their establishment. So it's another example of using digital infrastructure to affect our behavior in the physical space. According to Thaler and Sunstein, nudges are aspect of choice architecture, which is the organization of context in which people make decisions. Our decisions can be influenced by the number of choices, the manner in which these choices are presented to us, and if there is a presence of a default option. So too little choice frustrates us, too much of it overwhelms us. The research shows that there is some optimal amount of choice that affects our sense of control and autonomy. Does this relate to the spatial design? When we look at the number of choices at the street like this, as a pedestrian, we have very little choice. It is unlikely to anyone to walk on the street as his or her preferred choice. If we still choose it because it's the fastest way or the only way, the experience is quite frustrating and monotonous due to the repetitiveness of the surrounding and lack of visual stimuli. On the other hand, in the environments that are complex, like large-scale buildings, the number of choices can be overwhelming. The navigation problems here, which is wayfinding, are often solved by limiting the number of navigational choices and therefore cognitive overload for pedestrians. So we talked about number of choices. Now I will talk about how the manner of in which the choices are presented influences us. We see that skill presentation of choices makes some options more salient than others. We see it often in some pricing plans, application forms, but also in supermarkets or canteens where the products that are placed on our eye level are more likely to be sold. The saliency for architecture I will present on an example between stairs and elevators. So when we are more likely to choose stairs over elevator. So staircases can look very different. Very often they look like the one we see on the left-hand side. They are placed in the middle of the floor plan with limited access to the daylight or outside views. On the other hand, they can also look like the one on the right side with daylight and social space and so forth. The research shows that in the comparable buildings, if the staircase is located next to outside views and it has an access to the daylight, we are more likely to take it instead of an elevator. And if it's additionally open to the public space or some shared space, we are more likely to take it up till 6 times. This is research from Perkins and Will. The next aspect of choice architecture is the presence of the default. So the default option is the one that is presented to us as a pre-selected choice. It doesn't demand from us any effort. We usually choose defaults when we operate in so-called don't make me think mode, under time pressure, energy depletion, or lack of sufficient information to assess these choices. One of the examples how powerful the default option can be is the experiment done with 40,000 German households about renewable energy. If the household had to choose by itself that it opts in, only 7% decided for this choice. If this was, on the other hand, a pre-selected options for them, 70% went for the green energy. How this can be related to the built environment? Do we have default options? One example I can think of is cities infrastructure. So how the cities are developed, city planning and public policies define whether our default commuting option will be bicycle or car or public transport. This is example of Copenhagen and Dutch cities, where in Copenhagen, for instance, 62% of people uses bikes as a first commuting mean. To sum it up, I would like to say that when we design spaces, we also design human choices. And I hope it can contribute somehow to the discussion about urban depth and autonomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so neatly less time than you were allocated too. You had a whole 2 minutes to play with. Thank you so much, Karolina. That was absolutely fascinating. And yes, it draws again the parallels in my mind between web design or user experience design in the digital environment and user experience design in the physical environment. So next up we have Natalia Olszewska. And Natalia is a researcher in neuroscience applied to architecture. And she works between these disciplines to change our architectural and urban environment and make it more people-centered. Natalia is co-founder of Impronta, a neuroscience and behavioral sciences consultancy for architecture, and the fellow of the Center for Conscious Design.
Thank you,
Natalia.
Jane. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been very interesting so far. So I'm just going to show my screen. Okay. Sorry. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
That's brilliant. Okay. Let me just check if the slides are changing. That's great. Okay. So one more time, thank you very much for your introduction, and just for everyone who's listening to this presentation, please bear with me, because the first few slides are going to explore the notion of neuroscience applied to architecture. I wasn't sure if every listener is familiar with the field. So yes, I'm going to speak about how we apply neuroscience to architecture, or how we experience architecture from a neuroscientific point of view, but then I promise it's going to make sense. And I will be speaking more about the problem of autonomy, what it means to be autonomous, and what neuroscience has to tell us on the problem of autonomy. And then I'm going to link it somehow also with architectural design. So yes, this is the presentation outline. I'm going to speak, as I said, about neuroscience for architecture, neuroscience on autonomy, and there will be some conclusions. So neuroscience applied to architecture is a new field, and let's say it takes its origins from the foundation of Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture back in 2003. John Eberhard, an American architect and the founder of Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, stated once, I've come to believe that the key to understanding how our brains enable our minds to experience architectural settings is consciousness. So the whole point of a discipline that I practice is that you inform design decisions from the perspective of the user. That is to say that you start designing from inside to outside. You apply into design process some insights on human perception and cognition. You might also ask, what do we know about mental state that we want to support in architectural space, be it creativity, collaboration, or the topic of today's discussion, also autonomy. So our responses to architecture are not only subjective, as often repeated, but in many instances they are universal. And this is because we all share a certain anatomy and physiology, and our brains are structured in the same way, even though we are distinct individuals who belong to different cultures and have personal stories. And Panksepp and Bevan, the authors of The Archaeology of Mind, propose that there are two kinds of consciousness. One which is more primordial, affective, and associated with subcortical structures that we also share with other species. And the second one, more cognitive and cortical. And what does it mean for architecture? Sarah William Goldhagen, Experience of Architecture, an acclaimed architectural critic in her book, Welcome to Your World, How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives, discusses two main channels for architectural experience, an indirect one and direct one. These two channels are also consistent with neuroscientific research on emotions. Canadian neuroscientist Ledoux proposed some time ago that there is a slow thinking high road that is indirect channel and the speedy low road that is direct fast road. Okay. Direct unconscious responses are physiological and they are not learned. And they relate to the affective aspects of consciousness that I've discussed. They are also pretty universal. So certain intensity of light, some types of sounds, unpleasant smell, sharp objects provoke a sudden automatic response. And neuroscience research suggests that this bias exists since in the evolutionary past, we had to react towards ever-present threats, and it was advantageous to sense them fast. The second channel for architectural experience is more cognitive, based on some schemas or cognitive maps. The neural correlate of a cognitive map is the placeal system, which is located in the hippocampus. So cognitive schemas entail more cortical levels of experience, and they are more culturally and individually conditioned. So for example, a person who lives close to Tower Bridge will create a cognitive map of their neighborhood, and they will likely treat Tower Bridge as a landmark. So now, what neuroscience tells us about human autonomy? Felsen and Reiner, the authors of the paper, which I cite in here, How the Neuroscience of Decision-Making Informs Our Conception of Autonomy, propose that autonomous decision is 1, consistent with higher level desires, 2, it's rational, and 3, it's not influenced by any external factors beyond individuals' control. I'm going to discuss these aspects briefly. So it might be somehow simplistic to classify human desires as belonging to one order or level. However, we can talk about a hierarchy of desires which reflect structural and hierarchical organization of human brain. So the older part of the brain, like brainstem, is largely responsible for unconscious reactions and automatic behaviors such as regulation of breathing and body temperature. The cerebral cortex mediates more complex cognitive tasks, which often require conscious awareness. There is also an intermediate level that is limbic system. So there exists a strong correlation between cortical function and the capacity for autonomous decisions. And autonomy requires some level of executive control, which is linked to the workings of prefrontal cortex. Now, even healthy adults whose brain and prefrontal cortex is mature struggle to remain autonomous under some circumstances. For example, consider being in line at a cafeteria and deciding to have a salad or a brownie. Let's imagine that there are two circuits, salad circle represented by cortex, and brownie circle represented by limbic system responsible for pleasure. And they compete with each other. Who wins depends on time, effort of individual, and framing, that is choice architecture that Karolina discussed. So we spoke about different levels of desires and how they are related to autonomy. Now, the second aspect of autonomy is rationality. So what do neuroscience and behavioral sciences tell us about rationality? So the evidence suggests that our rationality is bounded. Why? Because we all have some cognitive limitations, because the information that we use to make decisions is imperfect, and because of time constraints. And that means that our decisions are not optimal, they are suboptimal. The second insight on rationality is that rationality against common knowledge is closely linked with body states, and it's not seated in our pineal gland as envisioned by Descartes, or in brain only as viewed by first generation of cognitive neuroscientists. And finally, the third aspect of autonomy is freedom from undue influences. The final condition for autonomous decision is that people must be free from external influences. And it's possible to be free of them if, one, they don't exist, but that rarely happens in life. Two, we are aware of them. So now I'm coming to conclusions, thank you. So concluding from perspective of neuroscience, that is perspective of human cognition, we can talk about existence of some drivers of autonomy. These are executive control, rationality, and freedom from external influences. Now, this is one of the models, it's kind of framework that sometimes I use at my work. It's a model of architectural experience provided by Professor Oisin Vartarian. He's a professor of neuroscience, and his collaborators. And he speaks about engagement of various systems, which reflect also all these levels, affective and cognitive, that I was talking about. And to name these three systems which interact when we experience architecture, starting from left bottom and going clockwise, it's sensory motor systems, so our senses, whatever we perceive, knowledge meaning systems, so everything we've learned in the past, our cognitive maps, and aspects of cognition, and our emotions and value system connected with the reward system and decision making. That has consequences for human behavior. And now concluding also, and maybe indicating some spatial metrics. So speaking about autonomy and drivers of autonomy in space, again, going from left bottom clockwise, from the perspective of sensory motor input, the person, in order to be autonomous in space, needs to perceive inclusion and needs to feel included. That is more than lack of personal barriers. This is more than accessibility. Inclusion means there is some sort of correspondence or match between one's cognitive and physical abilities and environment. Inclusion enables participation in space, and that also strengthens the sense of control over environment. From cognitive point of view, environments, and some speakers were talking today about it, environment needs to be comprehensive or tangible. A person needs to be also free from external influences, that is aware of framing. And the last aspect, person's attentional mechanisms related also to prefrontal cortex need to be restored, hence importance of restorative spaces. It's very difficult to exercise autonomy in stressful environments which overload us with sensory and cognitive information, and which we perceive as either stressful or threatening. So these are my insights for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. Fascinating presentation. And our final presentation today is Machiel van Dorst, who is Professor of Urbanism at TU Delft, and he's an environmental designer and specialises in environment behaviour interaction and the implications for urban design. His research into behaviour includes perceived control, social safety, community design, child-friendly cities, and health through design. Machiel.
Thank you. Let me open my presentation. if this works. Computer gets a bit slow at the end of the day. So, can you see my screen? Some people nodding.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I heard a lot of interesting talks today, and I see a lot of relations with my own work. I'd like to talk about the different zones between public and private. So there's already a relation with the first speaker, David, here, because I have to go to the second slide, but it doesn't work. Yes, it works. Take some time. Of course, formally, there's public and private, and this formal regulation is due to clarity, and it's set in stone by law. That makes life easy, one thing. Yet, law is not the goal in its end. It follows, I think mainly it follows the need of feeling safe. So the law creates a clarity, but in a very static way. So the wall is older than the law that follows it. Walls and rules are there for safety, for clarity on both sides, and to create borders between the public and the private. Good fences make good neighbors. There are two observations I like to make here. I think my computer is a bit slow, but yes, something happening here. First of all, reality is a bit more complex than this. For instance, what you see here on the left here, you see two levels of shopping in a dense urban center, in this case, Rotterdam. So the new level below ground is privately developed. So it's private space. Important is you cannot see it. So if you want to take your bicycle downstairs, someone comes from the shadow that stops you, that's not allowed. So in this complexity, sometimes the clarity is missing. And that clarity was the starting point for us to feel safe. And yet it doesn't work in this example. Point number two, I like to emphasize, this is not only about defensible space, the theory of Oscar Newman. It's about creating different qualities. And one interesting aspect is, by creating different zones, you create the possibility of crossing borders. And in non-COVID time, that's of course our major hobby, crossing borders, and it starts at your front door. So with these different zones, already a transition zone is needed between private and public. This, what we call semi-private or semi-public space, is in between your personal realm and the rest of the world. Like the example on the bottom left, you see the possibility to put down your groceries next to your front door. You open the door to your private realm, and you are kind of safeguarded from the rest of the world. And that works. So on the example on the right in Eiburg, Amsterdam, we asked the architects to provide the semi-public zone in every building block. But we need some theory to back this up. And for that, I'm going back in time, back to the 70s, to the work of Altman. And I'm really a fan of him, but we can discuss that later. He is saying a basic need of all is to control our social interaction. That's why we have walls, doors, laws, etc. And interesting about this theory is it's not about the amount of interaction, it's about having control over as a basic need. He defines this, by the way, as privacy. Privacy is the amount of control over social interaction. So sometimes, so it's a bit different than what colleagues like Jan Gehl are saying, people go where people are. It's more than that. Sometimes you don't want to have that much interaction, and if you don't get it, that's fine. that's a satisfactory match. And sometimes, of course, you get more interaction than you want, or the other way around. And the first example, it's called crowding. Realize it's more interaction than you want as a person. So you can feel crowded being with one other person in a smelly elevator, for instance. So it's not about the amount of people. And what makes it more interesting even, and that you see in the drawing on the right, for you as an individual, it's different over time. It's different now than in half an hour. It's different today, and then it might be in 10 years. So this dynamic is fascinating. That's not enough. To make it a bit more complex, does this move? Not yet. Okay. Try to move some, sorry. It doesn't work like I used to want it to work. Yes. You don't see my screen at this point in time.
No,
Sorry
you've just
for that.
stopped screen sharing.
Yeah.
You can see your impressive bookshelf instead.
I don't want to say I've read them all, of course.
You're back on.
I'm back on, yes. My computer is a bit overheated at the end of the day. So to make it a bit more complex, what you see here on the left, you as an individual have interaction with your social and physical environment. And the physical is the natural and the built environment. You can see that as one dynamic construct. At the same time, of course, this individual perceives his or her environment, follows appraisal, and there follows an emotional response, and you try to cope with that. And by coping, you can do different things. And one of them is, of course, changing your relation to your environment. Changing the scene, go somewhere else, etc. Turning off your camera. We have a lot of possibilities here. So this is the dynamic process. It's related to what Natalia already said, of course, the dynamic of interaction. But on top of that, to make it really complex, which is of course part of any design assignment, privacy is something of the individual, but maybe also something of a group of people. That is at least implied by Altman. So you have privacy of your own room, but maybe also together we have privacy of our street, our neighborhood, our city, etc. So the same place can be a private place of a group and a public place of a smaller group or an individual. I think this is a universal need. That's why I'm going to an example at the other side of the world and going back to the scale of the house again. We're here in Surabaya. On the right, you see the center of one of the biggest cities of Java, second biggest one. Middle in the center, there is Tunjungan area. It's informal or a kampong area surrounded by a kind of a wall of shops and surrounded by a stream of not water this time, but cars. And inside, these are the houses. A long time ago, when I visited for the first time, the local professor said, don't live there because you don't have any privacy. Well, that's fascinating from my perspective. So I rented a room there. And indeed, I experienced a lot of crowding at the first time. That has to do with the fact that I was used to sit outside in the street reading a book. But in here, the zone of the street, in here, I spread the message, hey, I'm alone. Is there someone who likes to have some interaction? So people came walking up to me all day long. Can I practice my English, etc. And then I find out that the zoning in this case, from private to public, is more inside the house. A bedroom, a family room, a guest room, a porch in front of the house, etc. So here you see also the complexity of different zones that facilitate my need of controlling my social interaction. And this complexity is in the built environment everywhere. We sometimes neglected that in the past in a modernistic way of building, but this is a way to facilitate this need. Further down the road, we did studies with students, finding out what's the quality of this transition zone between public and private, for instance. And you see a lot of variations, a lot of signs to what makes it readable for the visitors on how to behave in a certain place. And of course, the complexity is always in the bigger scale, like here in the neighborhood, where you have different forms of public and private space due to different scales, but also to different meanings of different places in the neighborhoods. Some are more used by a part of the neighborhood, some are used by the whole neighborhood. And why? Well, there are all details to that, to make that understandable.
Sorry, Machiel, I was so engrossed in what you were saying I forgot to give you your 8-minute warning. That was actually 10 minutes. Your timer just went off. So you've had 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. So I end with this last slide. What I try to figure out, what are the guidelines here to help us designing this complexity? And designing means facilitate this different forms of social interaction by individuals and groups, by creating different zones, make them legible, understandable for all, awareness of the different user groups of residents, visitors, etc., and the awareness that the same location can be more private, more public. And maybe the best example is on the bottom left, where you see the very public square in the center of Amsterdam, which is during Memorial Day of the Second World War, a very private place of the inhabitants of this country. And it's the same place. Okay, thank you so much. And sorry for a bit of chaos.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'll now hand you over to Ben, who's going to chair our discussion.
Okay, folks, thank you to all of our presenters. As Jane says, my aim now is just to facilitate us having a discussion, I think, for sort of a little, just around half an hour, maybe slightly longer before we wrap up at 5 o'clock. Just a couple of ground rules. There are different ways that you can indicate that you want to ask a question. One way is to start adding to the Miro board that Jane and Hannah have been indicating to you in the chat here. I can see quite a lot of questions there already. One practical point that we didn't consider when we were designing this is that, of course, lots of those questions are anonymous and aren't linked to the people who named them. So with respect to some of those, I think what I might do is read them out myself and invite the speakers to talk to them. But if there's a question that you'd like to ask specifically, put your name on it or put the question into the chat screen in the Zoom here, and I'll call you in order. I think that's probably the best way to proceed. So let me get the Zoom and the Miro board up next door to each other. And I think that I wanted to, let me start with a sort of question for David that various people have, various people raised in your presentation, David, which is about signs. This point you made that needing signage might indicate that design isn't working hard enough. How might we go about making signs more harmonious? And is there really that kind of opposition that perhaps you hinted at in that question?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not anti-sign. I'm not saying we should get rid of all signs. I think clearly signs are useful. I've made the point about signs because what I wanted to do actually was make a broader point that everything around us has kind of significance and a signifying effect. So thinking about this idea of depth structure, I was asking myself, what signs are there, whether they are tangible through to barely tangible or intangible, just almost imagined, just cultural or psychological conditions that we can detect. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that, as someone sort of does actually, that the focus of my presentation was about the visual sign telling us not to do stuff. That wasn't intended to be the focus of my presentation at all, to be honest. It was those visual signs with text and logo is one part of the signifying system around us. And I think Karolina and Machiel actually both sort of indicate the same kind of attitude to the places around us, that we read the places around us, and we do seek some clarity, and there are ways in which we can imagine ourselves as belonging, or it being our place or our private place, whilst the place is simultaneously operating at a different level. So an example might be, you're in a shop, often we know that we don't go behind the till, and there isn't a sign that tells us you're not allowed behind the till, you just don't go there, because there's a whole set of design codes that we come to understand. The fountain centre in Belfast I found kind of interesting, because I felt that that was a good example of where there is a tension between the designed environment, or the designed intention, and then the ways that the management practice or regime around that site operates. And there is a real tension there. So whereas the design and the overall intention is really to bring people in and welcome people and get them to play and have a sort of make a rather sort of Spartan place as joyous as possible, the place is actually then belittled by the number of signs, including, for example, one of my images, a railing which had a sign on it saying, do not go beyond this railing. Well, that's what the railing's for. So it doesn't need a sign to tell us that you're not to go beyond the railing.
That's wonderful.
It's the same with the escalator. You know, we know how to use an escalator. No one's going to get on their knees to read the warnings about escalator use. So I was making a sort of general point really about signs and their place within that kind of legible system around us.
Understood, thank you. But I think this is one of those places where we might be able to create some connections between some of the presentations. So Jane in the chat has pointed out that maybe the slightly different disciplinary perspective from Natalia and Karolina might be interesting to draw on here. I wonder, Natalia and Karolina, perhaps in that order, whether you've got anything to say about the role of signs and how that feeds into how we are as agents navigate in space. Silence.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I'm sorry. No, it's interesting. I mean, you know, I've been in this field of neuroscience applied to architecture for the last 3 years, and when I was doing a master in neuroscience applied to architecture at EUAP in Venice, I would say there were different groups of architects, and different professors had different kind of narrative. So some of them were like strengthening the importance of reading spaces. They were saying that this is how we appraise spaces. They were talking, so I would say that's the paradigm of semiotics, right? Ability to comprehend, to understand the signage. But there's this new paradigm, which is a paradigm of not only understanding environment through the vision, but multisensory perception and multisensory engagement. And I think you were also talking about it, because you were talking about, I'm sorry, David, you were talking about textures, right? You were also talking about interpretation of textures. That's something to do with tactile sense or haptic sense, and some sort of association. So, so yes, I'm not sure what is the precise question. I think we, again, I think narrative, understand, comprehension of signage is extremely important in our understanding of space, but it's just one of many levels. That's what I would.
Thank you, Natalia. No, that's very illuminating. I don't know whether you have anything you'd like to add to that, Karolina.
I would like to maybe add one point, that I see these signs that David's shown as an expression of certain policy, and I would like to talk about public parks in Paris and Zurich, for instance. They are very similar. Spatially, they are similar spaces. Yes, they are parks, but The policy is in Paris is that in many of these parks you cannot make a barbecue, and in Zurich it's allowed. And just one regulation creates very different appropriation of space. So we have very lively family meetings here in parks, and we cannot see it in many parks in Paris, where the behavior of people is restricted to be more official in that sense. Thank you.
Thanks, that's very useful. I'm going to take us back to the Miro board now, but if you have specific questions you'd like to ask, please do put them into the Zoom chat and I'll call you afterwards. But I've noticed a cluster of questions for Paula that have come through, which I think center around this idea of the aim for spaces to be accessible on the one hand, and then the question of how successful the architectural aim has been and how we go about measuring that. Paula, one of the questions specifically asked about the Musée d'Art in Nantes, but more generally, how successful do you think the interventions that you described are for improving accessibility? And is there a way that the architects of these buildings have tried to explore that and how it worked?
Definitely, I think, well, certainly from the museum in Nantes, because the entry points were at two different locations, and it has a very, very different feel to it. I think that that alone would attract a different audience, as it were. Obviously, there are the post-occupancy evaluation and all this sort of thing. I'm not sure how that works in France, to be truthful with you, but again, it's visitor numbers and all of this sort of thing, and there are ways to gather that information. And I don't have specifics on that particular museum, but I suppose the architecture for me is about correlating it with the intentions of the museum and providing, a larger user group. Into that was obviously the activities that are now, are now being offered by the museum, which is quite a lot more than previously. So I think that's just a marrying, I would feel, a marrying of the design with the extra facilities. And also that particular one for me was interesting because it has a crossover of preconceived ideas of what the museum was before and what it offers now. And so I think from that point of view, accessibility in that sense would mean there would be a higher percentage of a diverse amount of people visiting these two areas, but then that crossover is very real.
That's really interesting, Paula. Thank you. I mean, it's striking that kind of feedback that you've described, that information comes from the museum's character as a public space that is publicly accountable in a certain sort of way. Mm-hmm. And it would be interesting to think about ways that architects could get that kind of feedback loop being created even in other types of spaces, where perhaps there's the same aim to be accessible, but where maybe you just don't know how the space lives after you've designed it and handed it over.
Absolutely. Definitely. I know obviously we do the as I say, I'm not completely au fait with what statistics are out there other than the how it's the occupancy, post-occupancy evaluation, and whether there are other ways to gather that information, which obviously for our architects would be extremely useful.
Great, thank you so much. I can see various questions appearing in various places, and I'm going to try and sort of pull my thoughts together to make sure that people get the opportunity to ask. But since they're either anonymous or they're just appearing on the mirror board, I think I'm going to move on to some questions that people have asked of Bobby, actually. So if Paula's presentation spoke to the way that architectural depth can facilitate accessibility, then there's a sense in which Bobby's PhD research spoke to how it can facilitate integration and cultural diversity. And I noticed that somebody has asked how this type of use of space that you described, Bobby, how you anticipate that transferring to the next generation of immigrants, and whether this is going to be a stable long-term way of facilitating thriving of different cultural identities.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I think in the futures, then yes, maybe there's a possibilities of looking at the generation of the immigrant as well. But I think at this point, it's actually my concentration is that's actually just on the first generations at the moment, because it's appear that the first generations will eventually have a clear image of what they have back in Thailand and then what they have here, where if you're talking about a second or third generation, is more likely the generations that more likely to be assimilate to the main cultures already. So yeah, it will be interesting that how that culture's mix will change and how that will appear in terms of the physical space that we're living in.
That's great. But it makes one of the questions that's here on the Miro maybe even more pointed, which...
Oh, Ben, you suddenly muted.
Oh, I have, sorry. I don't know why that happened.
You suddenly muted again.
Sorry, I was trying to do it the fancy way by just holding down my space bar, but that's not working. Sorry, Bobby. The question was, how does architecture allow for different cultural identities to thrive? And perhaps what you've just indicated is that there's a different challenge of thriving as you move down through generations when you're thinking about migrant populations. Whereas perhaps the challenge for first generation migrants is maintaining that link and that connection between where they are now and where they've come from. Now there comes to be a challenge of integration between second and third generations and that first generation set of people. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how these spaces might evolve yet again in order to try and facilitate that multi-generational integration for migrant populations.
It's probably will work both ways. At the moment, from what I've found and the materials that I have in working with the space for this migrant or something to do with identity and different culture, it's I think the architecture itself and the space, it's more likely, I mean, we probably would need it to be as I say, to be affordant for people, and then it's up to the people to actually use their imaginations or navigation or the agility to adapt and use that space in the way they want it. So it's have to be both way. But yes, I think architectures, as long as they have something that people or human can actually link up to it and know, have the experience before, and they can map and reproduce that kind of space again, then that will be the benefit. So the architects need to give that kind of sort of affordant ability for people to use them.
Great, thank you. So the next question is one that's cropped up in the Zoom chat from Agostina, who has a question about the reading of boundaries. In the interest of time, Agostina, I'm going to ask you to direct your question primarily at Machiel and David, I think, just so that we have space to squeeze in some more. But I wonder if you could elaborate on what you said there for us.
Thanks, Ben. It's a bit of a general question, but I think it has to do with the specificity of the types of people and the individuals that use space and how different their perceptions and behaviors in space are. And I think in both David and Machiel's presentations, I'm really interested in those spaces, the privatized public spaces particularly. And I would like David and Machiel, if they could elaborate a bit more on who those signs are aimed for in terms of both the graphic signs and the physical spatial signs, the little knobs on the floor and the graphic signs, and how some people are much more affected by those than others. And if they can elaborate a bit more on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Why don't you go first, Machiel?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Well, thank you for the question. Well, what's fascinating here is that if people perceive their environment, you got much more perception in a microsecond than you can digest. In smell, in feeling, etc., etc. And that's different per person. Depends on your state of mind, how safe you feel, etc. And in that complexity, you try to find your own way. So written signs, for instance, are not the best way to communicate, because there are a lot of, for instance, if you come from a central station, you want to go to the center of the city, the best way is to follow most people where they go to, and not looking first at the signs. That's what most people are doing, by the way. But here it's also about communication between the different actors in the built environment. It's about communication between the users and those who try to manage or to control the environment, like people from the municipality. And sometimes it's a bit naive, hopefully by putting text up that people will behave in a certain way. Which is a funny example, for instance, in Rotterdam South, a neighborhood nearby where there are some problems. We have streets that are quite unsafe, and up there is a sign. In this street, we know one another and we say hello. If you follow that text, people look at you if you're a bit weird. So signs, especially in text, it's a way to hopefully to manage the built environment, but I prefer that the environment is more managed informally, that it should be readable in itself, that people could feel safe. But the complexity, and you mentioned that, different people might perceive the same environment in a different way. And I like the word Bobby was just using, affordance. That's a theory of Gibson. One environment has different affordances to different users. So a different in height is different for someone that's old than someone that has a skateboard or someone that likes to sit down. That complexity is just a reality, which is fun to observe, but there's not one formula there.
Thanks, Machiel. David, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Only a couple of words, really, because I I do agree with what I've just heard. I think that idea of affordance is really useful. Things like shopping malls, especially a shopping mall in North America, might communicate to groups of young people ideas of safety, or even just an environmental comfort. So in Canada, in Toronto, a shopping mall might indicate warmth in the winter, whereas to other groups like the security guards and other kind of representatives of the client, the shopping mall is not about environmental comfort or safety for youth groups, and those youth groups will then be read as a nuisance. So then you have those different interpretations of the same place, whether it's a place, the mall is a place for loitering, or if it's a place for safety, and we're thinking about different interpretations of the same group. So I think affordance is, I agree, an incredibly useful way through the complexity of this. And it just briefly, in a Dutch context, Machiel may or may not be interested in my collection of many hundreds of photographs of front doors in Amsterdam, because I'm interested in thresholds and the way the Dutch do it, and long have been. And I have a photograph of a threshold condition in Amsterdam where there's, and as Machiel's already shown, actually, there's a change in texture, a change in level, a change in the suggestion of enclosure that the domestic dwelling offers. But there's a bench in that zone, in that threshold zone. And on that bench is a sign saying this is not a public bench. And that sign is in English. And so the sign is clearly there for people who cannot read that threshold condition of it's a semi-public place or a semi-private place, but really it's a threshold zone that is more attached to the house than to the public realm outside, and therefore it's become necessary for a sign to be adhered to the bench if you can't read the urban signs. So I think all of these things, Agustina, speak to different people at different times in different ways. It depends on perhaps that idea of affordance.
Great, thank you ever so much. The next question that I'd like to invite is from Matthew Barrack, who has a sort of methodological question that spans quite a lot of the presentations, I think. Matthew, why don't you take us away?
Yeah, thank you. I suppose when we started with the presentations, I was struggling to find something to ask about a particular presentation, but as we started to go through them, especially because different disciplines and practices are represented by this collection of speakers, I noticed that in the slides and also the kinds of diagrams and flow charts on the one hand, or sketches and mark making. For instance, the last speaker had those drawings by students and so forth. And one of the things that struck me about this analytic of depth that we are looking at is the way that the practice of mark making, of the relationship between seeing and designing, is quite interesting in really getting to grips with what we mean by depth. And I mean, I would say this because he's my student, but I actually found Bobby's drawings really interesting because they move between, on the one hand, this analytical domain, and on the other hand, this effort to, if you like, synoptically, almost as a narrative on the one hand, or on the other hand, kind of synesthetically bringing everything together, and these different registers of experiencing spaces in place and time captured something of that depth that I felt some of the other presentations, which were much more kind of analytical, didn't get in the same way. And interestingly, the architectural one, number 2 by Paula, which is something I relate to because I'm an architect. I found some of the spaces that we were looking at strangely bland and undepth-like, because the kind of the depth and richness of the actual spatial experience was somehow not communicated in the visual. So it's a very open-ended comment and question, but I think methodologically, the modes of depiction and representation of the of this question of depth become quite important to the philosophical dimension, especially bringing together the kind of higher order functions of being in a place and what it means to you philosophically around questions of autonomy, and on the other hand, the kind of tectonic experience of being there. That's all I have to say. So it's not really a question, but I don't know if anyone wants to respond. I particularly found this in relation to the last presentation because of the different forms of representation that we were shown, and also the fantastic comment that Machiel made, which is we try to do a diagram and then the space itself is more complicated.
Thank you, Matthew. I think I know that one of the aspirations that Jane and I have for this project is to have the opportunity to think methodologically about how we do this kind of architectural research, but also how we do this interdisciplinary research. I think you're right that we didn't see diagrams just from the people speaking about spaces. We also saw the structure of agency and the nature of nudging in Natalia and Karolina's presentations represented graphically as well. So I think I might suggest we hold that thought that you've got as part of the emergent sort of methodological layer of what we're doing, and maybe return to it in subsequent meetings, I hope. I think we're starting to run out of time, but I wonder, and James, the boss here, I wonder if we maybe have time for 5 minutes more of discussion, and then we try and wrap up very quickly in 5 minutes. Does that sound?
Yeah, I think so. That sounds right to me.
So in that case, I wanted to go to a set of questions that were posed for Karolina, which are about the ethics here, basically. I think that several people have asked questions about whether there might be problems in nudging, problems of making judgments on people's behalf or making people do things for the greater good. And I wonder if you have anything you'd like to say about those ethical challenges as well as the ethical opportunities that you highlighted in your presentation.
Well, of course, there are ethical challenges to that thing. the basic, I would say it gives, as architects or designers, the knowledge about nudging demands more responsibility from us. But on the other hand, we have already some research that can help us in design. Like this behavioral research shows that anyway, if we say we do a neutral design, it's impossible. So we anyway will nudge people towards certain things. And on the more like theoretical aspect of that, there is the term libertarian paternalism, which politically one would discuss whether it's good, for instance, to as a default to subscribe employees for retirement plans, whether it's better not to do it, and what it would result with. So yes, there are ethical aspects that are important here, and how we deal with it, it's questionable. It's an open question, I would say.
Yeah, that's a great point. I could abuse the chair here, since I'm a political philosopher who's thought and written about nudging and ways that preferences are influenced, but I'm not going to, because I want to also pose a question to Natalia, I think, which pulls together several of the things that people have said on Miro, which is this, I think, as I draw them together. What you talked about in your presentation, Natalia, was a lot to do with the kind of neuroscientific underpinning of how people are influenced by the spaces they move through. A couple of people asked these questions about how that interacts with phenomena of cultural difference. So whether this is sort of a universal process which is invariant across different cultural contexts, and indeed whether there might be ways in which a feeling of belonging and being in a specific cultural context might be an additional requirement for autonomy that goes beyond the maybe completely foundational things that you picked out. I wonder if you'd like to talk about that.
Yes, I'll try to. Like addressing I think the level of culture, I would say it's some sort of intermediate level, right? So I was talking today about some primordial or instinctual or physiological responses towards environment, which are pretty universal. And then I was also talking about the fact that we keep on establishing some sort of cognitive maps and comprehension, which is also related to semiotics, shared understanding of landmarks and some sort of yes, that constitutes a sense of identity, and also certainly aids to sense of belonging. So I would say that I think people, myself, I've got an experience of living in different countries over the last 15 years, and I think I didn't always feel totally autonomous in foreign countries, also because of this lack of a deeper understanding of culture, and I felt that I didn't share this intersubjective layer of experience, which was to do with symbolism of some elements of space and so on. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think culture can be an issue when it comes to autonomy and comprehension, like deeper comprehension of what's going on around us. We're not talking about boundaries, even though they can be also culturally established. We're not talking about accessibility, which is lack of physical barriers. We are talking about intersubjective dimension.
That's great, and I mean that links with some of the things that emerged from the more sort of grounded investigation of spaces that we saw in some of the other presentations. I think that you have these patterns which perhaps described at a high level of abstraction all look universal and the same, but that they're very multiply realizable and specific to the particular individuals for cultural reasons, like you said, but also, I mean, even within a particular culture, those different ways that people encounter the barriers in Liverpool 1 that David talked about, depending upon their socioeconomic background, I think is another dimension of multiple realizability. Well, thank you. I think there are so many questions that are appearing on the Miro. There are so many things that we could continue to talk about, but I'm very aware of not wanting to presume too much upon people's time and to keep within the boundaries that we established. So I think, Jane, shall I hand over to you to wrap us up, or would you like me to do that?
No, wrap up.
Okay. Well, I think that the conversation, we want the conversation to continue. You've now all got access to the Miro board, and it's been exciting to see your cursors buzzing around the screen like bees, gradually getting to know the way that this tool can work. And we're going to leave this up, and we hope that people will be able to continue using it. So if you have questions that you feel like you have something to say about on there and would like to add to it as a developing record of our thoughts, please do. In particular, I'm aware that some people think very swiftly on the spur of the moment and are able to ask questions in session, and for some people it takes a little while of reflecting to work out what they want to say, and we want to make sure that those thoughts are captured too. We very much hope to be able to see many of you for our next workshop, which is the same time in a fortnight, 2 weeks away. Hannah has helpfully put the registration link for our next workshop, which is on neighbourhood depth, in the chat in the Zoom. So please do continue and come along if you can. You'll find out information about our speakers and so on there as well. Otherwise, I think the only other thing to say is thank you ever so much, everybody, for your participation. It's been a very exciting and fertile beginning to this little series of events that we're running. I think it's given me a lot to think about. I hope it's given all of you a lot to think about as well. So thank you everybody very much, and thank you especially to our pioneer presenters who gave us such an exciting and competent and varied set of presentations, and did such a lot also to keep to time, which is always very, very welcome. So thank you to David and to Paula and Bobby and Karolina and Natalia and Machiel very much. I have a sort of virtual round of applause for them.
Quietest round of applause in history.
It's very strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, okay, I think that's everything that I can think of to say. Is there anything that I haven't covered, Jane, that you would like to say before we
Only to say that if anybody in the audience wants to get in touch with anybody in the panel, then do just drop us a line and we can put you in touch. And I think there's a view to compiling well, as I said at the beginning, we want to create this collaborative network, and we'll need to compile a mailing list in order to do that. So we'll take your email addresses off Eventbrite, but if you don't want to be contacted, obviously you can just reply to us and say, don't talk to me anymore. But if you don't even want to receive one email, then make sure you get in touch with us first, just in order to be, that we're not messing with your details too much. So that's it. I think I'd like to reiterate Ben's thanks, and I really thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm really excited to see where the Miro board goes next. Do keep adding your thoughts. And a great way to close an event like this, in my experience, is for everybody to unmute themselves and say goodbye before you leave, and then you get this nice cacophony of goodbyes.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jane. Great.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
And Ben, should we stick around for a minute, and Hannah?
That's probably a good idea, yeah.
That was great. Thank you,
good.
guys.
I'm
See
glad
in
you
2
enjoyed it.
weeks.
Bye, Agustin.